Hi, in today's lecture we will be looking at identity and postmodernism. The key aims of the lecture are to give an overview of the different perspectives on identity and in particular its relationship to dress. So asking those key questions of, what makes us who we are and how may this relate to clothing. It's also about identification of quotes to help you to contextualise your ideas and to provide reference for the essay that we're looking at identity. It's also to highlight key practitioners and thinkers, so looking into the theory behind identity, but also looking at people who've used identity as a focus for some of their practice. And it will be about signposting to relevant literature so that you can do your own research around the topic. If we go first of all to the essay question, which is on identity, it starts with a title that claims that life is but a theatre, a series of facades, an exploration of identity. What I'd like you to do is, using the above quote, title, discuss the ways in which theorists and practitioners have sought to understand identity, particularly within a postmodern context. You should draw on relevant contexts such as advertising, films, performance, fashions, collections, etc., and include a discussion of relevant theories as they relate to clothing and adornment. So with all the essay questions, it's about you drawing on your own discipline to discuss the particular topic. As I say, it's also highlighting that this essay question is about the relationship between maybe modern and postmodern contexts, and it's about a collection of theory and also practice within that discussion. We can trace identity to three key historical phases, and these are identified as pre-modern identity, modern identity, and postmodern identity. Pre-modern identity, we're really looking prior to the 1800s, and I've drawn inspiration from images and paintings from the time, and within this context it was generally felt that our personal identity was something that was stable and was fixed, and that was defined by long-standing roles. So your identity became something that you were born into and was also then determined by certain institutions such as marriage, through the church, through the monarchy, through the state, and through work, etc. So in this context, we have a sense that we have fixed social roles that were defined from birth, and in some ways it was much more difficult to move from beyond these roles or to maybe question these roles. Clothing played an important indicator, I suppose, of people's social class and also occupation. As I say, it's interesting, I think, from a historical point of view, to look back through sort of fine art origins and paintings to uncover how clothing may have framed this sense of identity within these different contexts. If we then move to a modern world, which is generally seen as sort of occurring between sort of mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, it was a time of great industrialisation, urbanisation, as people were moving into the cities, and we saw the growth of the consumer society. In many ways, relating to clothing, we see that identity becomes a response to the city, as people moving into the city and were mixing in ever larger groups. We see a process which was known as the trickle-down theory. So as the wealthier classes adopted certain forms of dress, there would be in time a process of emulation, and possibly the lower classes would actually emulate and copy those designs. As that happens, as these styles become more popular, the lower classes, the upper classes, to distinguish themselves more, would then invent different styles of being, different fashions. And we've already highlighted how we could look at Simmel and Veblen as two sociologists of the time who discussed these concepts in greater detail. As I say, so this modern world then was marked by a process of industrialisation, the growth, as I say, of the consumer society, products being available in ever-increasing numbers, and for sale as well. So clothing wasn't being made necessarily at home, made to order it. There was beginnings of mass production. So within this context, clothing is very much spoken about in terms of the forces of fashion. So fashion being this process of change, this process of, as I say, emulation and distinction, generally between classes to distinguish or to emulate different classes. Within this context, there is not so much differentiation, so it's not the type of wild variety of clothing and different styles that we see nowadays. It would have been considered much harder to sort of step out of the norm, and it was more about fitting in with your peers, and this adherence to social codes over what was good, considered to be possibly moral, to be the correct clothing for the time, the place and the person. To understand identity, I think we need to look into different approaches and maybe its links to aspects such as personality, and we can see different approaches to the subject area. The traditional approach, is also known as this idea of sort of essentialism, is that biology makes us who we are, and that we all have an inner essence that makes us who we are. It essentially becomes part of our identity and our personality, and this is something that, as I say, we're born with. It's something that's inherent within us. So biology is the determining factor in this case of our identity. Postmodernists would generally disagree with this approach, and so therefore it's interesting to look at what we see as modern identity versus possibly a postmodern identity. In modernism, our identity becomes an expression of aspects of modern life, so our connection to modern life. It's about our expression of technology, so technology in the way that clothing will have been made, moving, as I say, from possibly handmade pieces to more industrialised processes. It's about the embracing of new materials within this context as well. And importantly, it's about communication, so it's an expression of the forms of communication that were present within a modern society. I say much of this was sort of centred around this idea of industrialisation and urbanisation, so it was communication that was taking place within the city, and the communication in ways of how different lifestyles were communicated. If we then move to ideas of postmodernism, which were really sort of happening probably in the mid 1900s, so sort of 1950, 1960, we see that then actually identity, rather than being purely an expression of these ideals, actually becomes more of a reaction. So how we react to modern life, and whether that's a positive or a negative way, our reaction to technology and new materials and communication. And I think these are important, very sort of subtle differences, but it sort of talks a little bit more about this possibly an antagonistic relationship, maybe where we see resistance to certain ways of doing, and in the implanting of new ways of doing. In this context, then, postmodernists moving away from the biological concept of identity actually argue that identity is formed by our social experiences. So it's those social experiences that become important markers and of this identity. Erving Goffman was one of the early writers looking into this concept of the self, and wrote a seminal text in 1959 called The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life. And within this, he put forward the idea that actually identity has become a series of facades. So relating this back to the essay question, the idea of it becomes a part of a facade, becomes part of a mask, and that life is a theatre. We're seen as actors within this sort of social life, and having different roles and developing those roles as well. In this context, what is important is that identity becomes fluid. It's no longer a fixed state of being, but actually there is room for movement. There's room for changing aspects of identity as we come into contact with different social experiences, and in particular, I suppose, our environment. As I say, just to highlight the timeline for this, so we can be aware of when we're looking for different aspects of sort of historical dress. So modernism essentially 1860 to 1960, and postmodernism is sort of 1960s onwards. We now, I suppose, live in this idea of a postmodern world. So some of these ideas then need to be seen within this context, because I suppose what is important is the social environment that we're looking at in order to contextualise the garments and the dress that we're actually looking at. You can also, I suppose, look to artists, because artists were very much about taking on board this idea of postmodernism and the mixing and matching of different reference points, as we saw in the lecture on intertextuality, this idea of bricolage, so borrowing from different sources to change and subvert meaning. Orlan is an interesting artist whose work I sort of see reflected in someone like Lady Gaga, who very much used her body as her canvas, undertook quite extreme plastic surgery and set it within the operating theatre, and in a way making that hospital environment the theatre in which she was acting out her role. So we see her here with some horns implanted in her head. Another postmodern text which is obviously interesting to look at in terms of clothing and dress is Orlando, who's written by Virginia Woolf. And there's a great article in the Bruzzi book called Undressing Cinema, which looks further at aspects of dress and its relationship to gender. So as designers, as people interested in an aesthetic appreciation of garments, we need to look at some of these within an aesthetic appreciation. The modernism movement, which was predominantly post-war, was very much about a simplified aesthetic. It was about stripping back the sort of the frills and the flounces and giving a very minimal and simplified line. It was also, the modern art and design movement was about utopian ideals, about how design can change our life by stripping back this fluff. We give a greater sense of meaning to life. It was also very much about truth to materials, which I think is quite interesting, this concept that what we look at should be the real thing. So if we're looking at something that looks like wood, it should be made from wood rather than being made to look like wood. And as in many ways, postmodernism came along and implanted its own aesthetics and said that actually in many ways the modernism movement had failed in some of its design ideals, and that in reality going for something very sort of simplified approach to life when actually life was very complex. Modern life, they argued in this context, was characterised by chaos. So therefore in artwork we see a mixing of materials, we see a different mixing of styles, bringing us into this idea of bricolage, as I say. It was about reusing images and drawing on issues of parody and irony. So again, the aesthetic of compositions of work, of collage, and of using images, as I say, to possibly subvert their original meaning or reinforce certain sort of political and social ideals. If we apply this to something like the city, which is obviously, our townscapes, which are important for our sense of identity, and also how possibly dress may fit into this environment. I think it's interesting to look. We have the Corbusier house on the top, which is very much embracing the modernist ideals, and the back, in the left-hand corner, something like graffiti, how that comes as an identifier of people into this context, but in an unordered way, in a slightly chaotic way. Someone as well like Madonna, who in the mid-80s and 90s took on quite a few of these postmodern ideals, where she did use irony and rhetoric within her dress, so adopting religious signs but subverting them in a way. Also very much concerned about her appearance, about the look and the different Madonnas that we actually see through time. So as I say, this idea that her identity becomes something that is fluid, in particular in relation to her appearance becomes fluid in that she can adopt different facades, possibly she can adopt different clothing to give us a different sense of her identity, and possibly for her in her way of playing out different identities. Someone that I feel is interesting to look at from a sociological perspective, and not necessarily from a design perspective, but definitely from a questioning and a thinking about our relationship to modern life, is someone called Zygmunt Bauman, who's a sociologist at Leeds University. And he wrote a book called Liquid Modernity, or came up with this term of liquid modernity. And here he argues that society is being transformed by the passage from the solid to liquid phase of modernity, in which all social forms melt faster than new ones can be cast. And I think this is an important point for this idea of fluidity, this idea of us being in a liquid state. So that as new sort of social forms are born out, that this is quite a quick and rapid process. As he argues, they are not given enough time to solidify and cannot serve as the frame of reference for human actions and long-term life strategies, because their allegedly short life expectation undermines efforts to develop a strategy that would require the consistent fulfillment of a life project. Bauman talks quite a bit about how modern life is marked by this idea of projects. And so I would relate back to someone like Madonna, who has gone through various different identity projects, possibly. But he says that in each case, and none of these have actually been given the time to, as he says, solidify and become important frames of reference. So they become merely just sort of little tasters, little steps in our life. So say I would highlight you to have a look at the book he has made. Leigh Bowery, I think, is another interesting performer, someone who uses costume, who uses dress to again portray aspects of his identity, and in their way become, as we see, sort of short life projects in the different characters that he builds and plays around with. In a postmodern context, then, as we talk about identity and its relationship to our social experiences, it's argued that then the body becomes a surface to be inscribed upon. It's transformed and manipulated by various hegemonic and institutional regimes. I think that's quite a difficult quote maybe to get to grips with, but essentially what it's saying is that our body in a social world is a canvas then that can be transformed by different aspects of society. Something like an institutional regime could be a school, so how we use a uniform, or if we go to work at McDonald's and we're given a uniform, that is our body being transformed and being manipulated. And this is within a postmodern context. What we're interested in is our reaction to that, as I say, whether we feel it's a positive experience or it's a negative experience. David Bowie, similarly, a performer who uses clothes, again this idea of sort of short life projects, this idea of fluidity, this idea of a liquid life in which we have different aspects of our identity being portrayed out. Another interesting theory that we can use to discuss identity in is the ideas put forward by Jean Baudrillard, who argued that actually reality in a postmodern world no longer exists. Instead, our sense of reality and identity has been superseded by notions of a hyper-reality and of simulation. So the idea that we live in a simulated world. And I think this is most easily understood within the context of advertising. As John Berger says, in adverts, it's about the portrayal of what we would like, what we would desire of a simulated world rather than a real world that is connected to us. Things like the internet have also led us to understand this idea of hyperreality. So like cosplay conventions are an interesting place where this sort of hyper-reality world exists, and again how clothing and costume becomes important of this notion. Similarly, someone like Lady Gaga, who I think plays again on this idea of the hyper-real, the transformation of body to be a hyper-real person. So the argument then becomes between identity being something that is a biological determinant to something that is based around social experience. And I think this quote summarises it, particularly in relation to dress. Elizabeth Wilson is an important writer who looks at fashion and this idea of modernity and dress and costume within her book Adorned in Dreams, Fashion and Modernity. I'll just read you the quote from that, where she says, "A part of this strangeness of dress is that it links the biological body to the social being and public to private. This makes it uneasy territory, since it forces us to recognise that the human body is more than a biological entity. It is an organism and culture, a cultural artefact even, and its own boundaries are unclear." And I think this, as I say, highlights that relationship between dress that transforms our body from a biological body into a social body. It transforms it from something that is private to us and is intimate to us to something that is then shared in a very much a public arena. So again, looking back at some of those performers and people, as I say, who've used dress to transform this and in a way communicate aspects of this sort of social interaction. I think, as she points out, that its own boundaries within this context also become unclear. If it is a path of sort of discovery, then that discovery at times can be quite traumatic, and maybe pushing over boundaries that other people would feel quite uncomfortable with. So linking back to, I think, this idea as well of hyperreality, something like games and video games is an interesting area to look at, and how different possibly genders are portrayed, different aspects of identity are portrayed within this context, this hyperreal context. It also leads us into the idea of our digital identities. I think this is increasingly becoming quite an interesting area of study. This idea to which, again, this public and private, so where we have an extended communication with one another, which happens privately, locally, and then globally, on a major scale. Within this context, the photo becomes all important. So that selfie that people take of themselves, the extent as well to which in this hyperreal world we can disguise our identity. We can actively portray a different identity. So something like an avatar, I think, is interesting, where in this context it highlights that fluidity of identity, in that we can change that. We can be somebody else in a digital world, a person that we may not be in real life. And this is, again, bringing us down to the idea of identity being in connection to technology, to new technology within society and our reaction to it. Said also within postmodernism is this idea of irony, of parody. So again, going back to someone like Cindy Sherman, who very much uses and draws from sort of quite an ironic palette of sort of stereotyping to portray her characters again. So we then come with the argument, or the idea, that dress is something that does connect us to the social world, and identity therefore is not purely a biological construct. Wilson, and again talking about dress, sees how it's a mechanism through which the body is connected to the social world. Clothing is seen as a cultural phenomenon, as an aesthetic mechanism for the expression of ideas, desires and beliefs circulating in society. It's this idea that it's conveying something about people's ideologies, about people's aspirations, and it's to the extent to which they fit in or do not fit in with the wider society. So it is about identity being a cultural phenomenon. Our identity is based as well on our political ideals and beliefs. Barbara Kruger was very clever in this in her work, where she was drawing again on stereotypes, but reinventing them, reconfiguring them to make us think about the political and the social aspects of the life that we were living. We're drawn as well within this slide to the idea of consumption also being an important part of this identity, particularly within a capitalist society. So I shop, therefore I am, is this link between consuming identities. So to understand a little bit further then about this political dimension of identity, we can look further at identity being broken down into different categories. So for example, issues to do with race and ethnicity can become important political battlefields, as Kruger mentions here, how our body is a battlefield. So our acceptance or our disapproval of certain dress codes that may come from race and from ethnicity, how this may have how this may be against some ideas to do with sort of sex and gender and religion. Disability within this context also becomes an important political area, and our culture. So possibly for some of us, this is about looking at consumption in this capitalist context, as I say. A further quote from Bauman sort of talks about this idea, coming back to this idea of liquid modernity and the role of fashion, but fashion in the context of fashion being about change, fashion being about this process of updating and getting rid of what is now seen as old. So he argues that you must lose the ponchos which were so much in vogue last year, since if you wear a poncho now you look like a camel. Donning pinstripe jackets and t-shirts is over, simply because no one wears them. And so it goes. If you don't wish to sink, keep surfing, and that means changing your wardrobe, your furnishings, your wallpapers, your look, your habits, in short yourself, quickly and as often as you can manage. And like that idea, he talks further in his book about this idea of the hunted and the hunters, and how it is about constantly trying to keep up to date, and to be seen to be being kept up to date. Of course, this is portrayed through shops. So he talks about your furnishings, and I'll never forget going into an IKEA shop, and I think the way that they're laid out, it's about inviting people in. It's saying, look, this could be your home, and seeing people interact in that sort of space is quite interesting. There's a family I once watched, and they were all sort of sitting around and around in the kitchen, almost as if they were at home. Someone had even gone to the point of trying to cut the piece of plastic, the plastic loaf of bread, and it looked interesting way that people were playing out aspects of that identity. And this brings us to a quote from Judith Williamson from her book Decoding Adverts, where she says that instead of being identified by what they produce, people identify themselves to what they consume. This is again an interesting point of looking at modern and then postmodern identity. So it may be in a modern context, it was more about what people were producing. We were much more about manufacture, and our links to identity work with our work. Now in a more sort of service orientated society, we and more of a consumer society, it's actually more about what we consume, because we no longer have possibly the capacity for production, and this starts at an early age. So the toys becoming an important point of, so we've all had a Barbie doll. She's representative again of this sort of fluid modernity. Sort of we have different Barbies to fit different sort of styles. A quote from the Bauman text also looks into the role of glossy magazines. Again, this idea of a simulated world. We possibly know that many of the models will have been airbrushed. There will have been sort of touch-ups to the photos. So what we are seeing is a simulation of the person rather than the person themselves. And it says, applying various techniques, we may change our bodies and reshape them according to different patterns. When browsing through glossy magazine, one gets the impression that they tell mostly one story, about the ways in which one can remake one's personality, starting from diets, surroundings, homes, and up to rebuilding a physical structure, often codenamed a proposition to be yourself. This link between, say, the media and identity, the media playing a role in shaping of ourselves. This, as you say, identity and power, they have important links. The power structures within society, as I say, that maybe sort of regulate identities, possibly put restrictions on certain expressions of one's identity. And there, in this context, it becomes a political message. Michel Foucault was very important in this, and his development of identity theory in relation to sexuality. So, as a gay man, his relationship to ideas of power and his idea of self-identity. And he argued that social order is maintained as people learn to keep checks on themselves. Later works saw self-identity as an active project influencing queer theory. In the history of sexuality, Foucault suggests power is not a fixed property held by certain groups, but is fluid and present in all interactions. Where power is exercised, resistance develops. This is a productive relationship. And I would relate this back to sort of protests and demonstrations where you have in quite contrasting opinions and ideas of power. So the police here we have on one side to the clown army on the other, who are using their dress in a mocking and satirical way. I'd look further at the website I've put up for further information. Lucy Orta is also aware of this idea of the political and the social, so her work Nexus Project was about linking communities together. Her work Refugee Project was about highlighting the issues to do with homelessness, and clothing or body covering and costume become important in this context. Similarly, this was an interesting project that I saw in New York a few years ago, which again was using clothing to look at identity, and it's where they have looked further. There is another area that we can look at within this, and this is what we call the mask of femininity, and this idea of masquerade, so the extent then to which it becomes an expression of femininity. Someone like Gillian Waring, who uses her body and uses clothing and sort of styling to portray different characters, so changing from a man in the middle to a woman on the side. This further highlights how, in this context, the body, together with the clothes that we dress it in, become meaningful products and representations. Again, it's about what that dress is actually representing and what it means. It's recognising as well that when we clothe the body, we do become in some way a commodity. We do become a product of society. Identity, of course, is also very important in performance. I, as a practitioner, within sort of costume context, have been working with we're making costumes for the past 15 years now for a theatre company who do lots of festival performances, also do sort of street performances, and it is about a telling of a story of these different characters. So we have the Red Arrows who will run around a field, and the idea behind this, the costume, is about, you know, blocking colour, using colour as a as an indicator of their characters. I like this quote from Eco, which again brings us to this idea of life being a theatre. It says it's not theatre that is able to imitate life, it is social life that is designed as a continuous performance, and because of this there is a link between theatre and life. And as designers, it's about bringing this life to the theatre, bringing this this rich, mix of characters. So something like the beach that we do, it's a piece of tarpaulin that's rolled out, and it's a fairly dysfunctional family that interact with the audience. It's about building up these characters and using sort of clothing to portray aspects of their character. Attfield wrote quite extensively on aspects of material life and spoke about how a sense of self which is expressed in different forms or satirical faces, so dress becomes a part of that. The paparazzi, another act that we do, is based on the idea of celebrity culture, so a group of adorning fans running up to people who are just, sort of hanging out in a festival environment, and the reactions are very interesting. So here we have Bruce Willis, who obviously isn't Bruce Willis, asking for people for their autographs, and then the photographer will come along and start taking photos, and the bodyguard will then actually sort of disperse the crowd. As I say, it is based on the idea of the celebrity culture, so the camera, we've mentioned before in relation to our digital identity, becoming an important tool in this building of identity and the portrayal of it within a media context. As I say, the media being important, so things like Heat magazine were interesting to look at for the paparazzi sketch and people's, as I say, reaction to that. So here we have Simon Cowell. The Red Arrows, about bringing in sort of key indicators and coming together as a team through the use of colour. Pac-Man, again, a well-known sort of character that people wanted to sort of touch and be and sort of and speak to. The inspectors, which started off as quite scary, we then had to tame them down a little bit, and as I say, again, the bus, which is about people standing in a line and people becoming their own characters. So I do feel that actually, environment is an important part of our sense of identity. So the festival environment for me is interesting in that it may contain many different sort of subcultures. It's about people coming and feeling comfortable or uncomfortable in their skin as they are forced to live in quite sort of different sort of surroundings and situations that they would normally be under, and how sort of clothing comes into this. There was an interesting study looking at festival performance by someone called Alice O'Grady, and did a research project around the festival environment, and took a travelling show to look at people's relationship to the characters, and you can have a look at that further there. So really what we're saying is that in this sort of postmodern or contemporary society, we have many different reference points. There is this idea that we are able to to change. There is more fluidity in our identity. There is more scope, I suppose, for difference. So we can look then at the positives and possibly the negatives of these postmodern identities. Obviously, a positive is that in this context, difference is celebrated. It's good to be different. It's not seen as something that is, unattractive or something we wouldn't necessarily aspire to. It's because of this fluidity that it's no longer sort of fixed for life. So we are able. This gives us a sort of slightly. Well, the idea is that it gives us a sense of freedom. Whether that can actually happen in reality is another thing. And it says that in a consumerist society, of course, we do this, we shop around for identity. This fluidity is enabled by a consumer society. In this way, our identity becomes something that is negotiated. It's something that is negotiated quite often, as I say, within this sort of consumerist context. But the negatives for this is that actually, we could argue that identity becomes quite unstable. It becomes quite a superficial thing. If it's all about the aesthetic, then actually, to what extent can we get to the core of the individual, to deeper aspects of personality? In this context, possibly it all does become a facade, and that it really, you need to be a strong character to play out these different roles, if not to ever be able to settle on one identity. And the argument goes that then in this context that identity becomes accelerated and extended and not fully realised or maybe accepted. Again, something like Pretty Woman is a key indicator of this. So how clothing and how dress actually becomes a superficial thing, because at the root she is the same person, but by wearing different clothing she is accepted or not accepted into certain situations. I think to conclude, I would point you to thinking about the following question. So the idea about what makes us who we are. The arguments that I've tried to uncover is this distinction between our biological self and our social self, between our physical self and between our political self. And these are all parts that actually build up something like education as well, very important in bringing about different aspects of identity. Another thing is to look into, how is our identity represented and disguised. Looking into your different sort of specialist areas, you might want to start pulling out aspects of dress which you feel represent parts of identity and possibly also disguise identity. What are the key signs of identity today? Again, something that you could look at within your own discipline, and thinking about how this may have changed over time. And then finally reflecting on the positive and the negative aspects of a postmodern identity. Mention this idea of celebration of difference, but then the problems of possibly superficiality and unstableness. To research further, I would take a look at the Riley et al. Book called The Meaning of Dress by Berg, which is a collection of different articles looking further into this, and also the Dress and Identity book by Roach Higgins, written a little bit later, but again has some interesting context for I think all different disciplines. So whether you are interested in costume or whether it is fashion, will give you some good pointers. You can also look at some sociological references, so someone like Anthony Giddens, who looks more at ideas about modernity and self-identity. And I would encourage those who are interested in the media to look at David Gauntlet, his book Media, Gender and Identity, and as I say again, look at the website, which gives there's more sort of resources available on that for helping us to understand identity.